Okay, thank you. That's an interesting segue into what I'm going to talk about. This is not a talk on security, it's a talk on trustworthiness, and that encompasses safety, reliability, interoperability, anything you want, predictable real-time behavior, autonomous systems, aircraft, and anything else is in scope. So the weirdness about this whole thing is that I've been doing this, well, my first job was 1953, working for the Navy as a programmer. And along about 65, I started on Multics. I was at Bell Labs in the entire 60s. And in the 70s, we did a system for NSA that some of you guys know about, the Proofably Secure operating system with formally specified hardware. And in 76, I was asked to create, and what I started doing there was pick horror stories that had happened and make sure that every issue of that thing since July of 76 had some horror stories in it. Oddly enough, I have contributed to every issue of SigSoft, every regular issue since, in one way or another. And so this is, the risk stuff started in 76 when Adele Goldberg came to me and said, we need a visibility of the ACM. And so I'm wearing my ACM shirt here, to be visible. And so she said, why don't you create some sort of an online representation, which I did. And that is still going today. Some of you are subscribers to it. The students should be reading it regularly because it's full of wonderful things about what goes wrong. Recently, we've had stuff like the 737 MAX and all of the problems there. The experience that one comes to very quickly is that there are no single causes for failure. That one was one where it was very clear that Boeing was noodling on testing and oversimplifying what they had to do. The FAA was incapable of monitoring them. The company moved to Chicago from United, or Boeing moved to Chicago actually, and the ethic in this country, or the ethos maybe, of paying off your stockholders before you worry about safety and reliability and all these other trustworthy issues that I've been mentioning, is such that we're getting ourselves into a real bind. So what I thought I'd do today was get through some of the history. And I know you guys have a lot of horror stories that you would be happy to offer. So this is not a talk that I expect to give as a normal hour and a half talk. Hour, okay, well that's true, yeah. Thank you. So I'd love to get you guys involved. Now, the hope was that there would be more students here sitting with us live. That's not working out. But I've got another shot at you in 3 weeks when I'm going to actually be talking about the hardware that we've been building for the past 9 years, and some of the recent developments of bringing this into the real world. And I'm also going to talk about the Thunderclap paper, which is a wonderful little USB-C stick, which completely takes over every system that you put it in. And it's a symptomatic problem of a fundamental flaw in essentially every system that is worrying about direct memory access from embedded devices and external I/O. So what I would like to do today is simply to walk through some of the horror stories that we have. It goes way back, and I have basically multiple persona. One is the Risks Forum stuff, which as you hear, is ongoing for a long time. The other is the idea of trying to build trustworthy systems, which some of you have been heavily involved in for many years. So that's next talk in 3 weeks. Today, let's just talk about what are the things that go wrong and what can we do about them. So my book, which you don't need to go out and buy, and it's available for 1 penny on Amazon as a used copy, and it's better if you get the 3rd or the 4th printing because there are fewer typos. And the correct typos are on my website to correct them if you do happen to stumble onto it in first edition, first printing, I should say. I look at the safety problems as something that is overarching. If you don't have secure systems, you don't have safety. If you don't have reliable systems, you don't have safety. If you don't have reliable systems, you don't have security. If you don't have security, you don't have safety. So the problem is that everything is interrelated in some way. And I know you have worried about some of these hierarchical layerings where you depend only on lower layers. You never depend on something that is less trustworthy if you can help it. And that's sort of the Ken Biba thing that some of you know about. So what do we do then if we're trying to build something? Yeah?
But occasionally people design systems so the lower levels were less trustworthy.
Yes, it's true. Well, the hardware is untrustworthy. Given this talk I'm going to give in 3 weeks, all of the hardware is untrustworthy.
But they've intentionally put in untrustworthiness at lower levels.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you have fictions like SEL4, which is a secure microkernel, which has been proved correct with respect to all of the assumptions they've made. But it has to trust that the hardware is correct, and it has to trust all of the application code. So the idea of building something on sand is not a happy one. I'll mention in 3 weeks that Microsoft has come to us and said that 70% of their security problems are little memory management problems, and that our hardware, in fact, takes care of all of those 70% of their flaws. That's an interesting thought, if true, and we're still in the process of trying to determine that. But that's for 3 weeks from now. For today, I'm getting a little hoarse. Let me grab a cough drop here. Today, I think I would like to focus on some of the horror stories that you guys might have. Mine go way, way back into passwords in CTSS, the story of the day in which the fortune cookie of the day came out as the entire unencrypted password file. Because the guy who had built the editor for CTSS had assumed that there would never be two people in the same process or the same directory working at the same time. So he had one fixed name temporary file, and he exchanged the temporary file with the working file. So beautifully, the password file and the fortune cookie file got crossed over. Now, this is a simple problem, and you think, gee, we ought to be able to not be that stupid. Well, short-sightedness is the issue of the day, I think. I use this Einstein quote a lot, that everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. And it's this no simpler that sometimes gets to you. I had a exam question I made in 1956, I think, when I was TAing the undergraduate computer course. And it required a 4 or 5 line program to invert the order of the bits in a string. And one of the students managed to make 3 programming errors in the same 5-line program. He had an off by 1 in the loop. He had a couple of other errors. And I thought, gee, that's interesting. What can we do with a 5-line program? Well, AT&T on Martin Luther King Day in 1990, if you were around, and some of you were not around then, had a very simple fix to their switching, their network switch stuff. And they made a 4 or 5-line program that changed the routing algorithm after a system had crashed. And they didn't test it because they figured it's only 5 lines of code or 4 or whatever it was. And so what happens? I think some of you may remember the day when you could not get a long-distance call across the country. And what happened was very simple, that when a switch crashed, it rebooted itself and originally sent a message to the other neighbors saying that we are now live again. They said, we don't need to do that. We just need to start sending traffic. And they started sending traffic, and it crashed all of their neighbors, which then rebooted and started sending traffic to all of their neighbors, which crashed all of their neighbors. And this went on for half a day. Some of you heard the story that 3 days later I got a phone call from 2 New York Bronx Science kids, acid freak and fiber optic. And they say, did you hear anything? And I said, what do you mean, did I hear anything? Well, we were on the switch that crashed, and we're afraid that AT&T is going to blame us for having brought down the entire network. I said, don't worry, 2 things. One is that they've now demonstrated that this was a bug in their software. And secondly, they've been claiming that there was never a hacker on any of the switches or switch controllers. This is impossible. It couldn't happen. So how can they come out of the closet and say, oh yes, we're going to blame these 2 high school kids? Okay, so here's a simple example of a propagating error. We've had, I go back to 1965, November, I think it was. I'm standing on the top floor of Project Mac 545 Technology Square, and standing in front of him in the computer room with Bob Daly. And all of a sudden, the disk arms are and we have the Northeast blackout. Okay, so the folks in the power industry said, well, we're going to fix that. We're going to change the algorithm so that can't happen again. And in my risks archive, I have probably 6 or 8, 9 total blackouts of either our entire West Coast, the entire West Coast plus Baja California and Vancouver, another East Coast one. And you say, well, gee, why can't people build algorithms that are sound, that anticipate all of the things that can go wrong? And that's a lovely question. And the answer is because nobody's paying attention to all of these things that have gone wrong in the past. They assume, oh, we can fix that with a little patch. I think I mentioned to you once that I am using a very old mailer, Columbia MM, which of course went completely to pieces on Y2K. And so somebody generated a patch which failed on January 1st, 2001. So there was another patch for that, which failed in 2002. All right, so how do we think in the large about things that go wrong? How do we anticipate all of the horrible things that can go wrong? So the reason I'm here is to suggest that in this Risks Forum that I've been running for God knows how long, and in its precursor in the software engineering notes, that there have been one horrible story after another, and in relationship to what you said in the beginning, we've been there before. Everything that was in the Risks Forum in my book in 1995 is still happening today in one way or another. So the bottom line for this talk is, particularly for the students, to say, think about what can go wrong and try to design things that won't fall flat on their faces when something does go wrong. Okay, so with that much as background, I can go on for hours and hours and hours on specific cases. But I wanted to get into some discussion with you guys about not only how can we prevent this, but how can we improve the education in such a way that the people who are teaching about computer systems and software and hardware and so on are going to find that the students are becoming more aware of what I'm starting to talk about. Any comments? Alan?
So don't we have an existence proof that it's possible, but maybe not affordable in the NASA discipline? Can never remember the woman's name, but apparently there's never been a bug that caused a system failure in her software.
There have been lots of problems in software. The very first launch.
There were, but it didn't lead to a mission failure.
No,
because they thought of the failure.
But it didn't lead to mission failure, but they had to delay the launch by 2 days.
Okay.
Because the guys who designed this damn thing never told the operational guys that there was a 1 in 64 probability of failure when they tried to reboot, because the 4 primary computers could not link up with the backup computer. And all I had to do was reboot it, and it would have worked. But it took them 2 days to figure that out, because the designers and the implementers had never told the operational guys that there was this possibility. It's a trivial thing to do.
How come the testing didn't catch that?
Random testing. Probability of 63 out of 64 that it's going to work. So testing doesn't prove very much. In that case, they did test it.
My point was that they did think of all the things that could go wrong, and they did, in large part, avoid them.
You said the word software.
Yes.
Now, you remember the Challenger
Right.
and the O-rings.
Yes.
Okay, it's not
That's not
software.
software.
It's not software.
No, but she had developed a discipline. I can't remember her name, but she developed a discipline that NASA used forever, as far as I know.
Are you talking about Margaret Hamilton?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
I can never remember her name.
Very nice articles on her lately.
She was Apollo.
That was Apollo.
Okay.
Yeah. And one of my buddies, my grad school buddies, was the guy who designed the Apollo guidance computer, Draper. And we were having a competition with him in terms of who was going to build the most reliable system. Ours was the software implemented fault tolerant thing that did 10 to the minus 10 probability of failure, provably, if the hardware was 10 to the minus 5. We got 5 orders of magnitude, but it was 7 processors, 7 buses, 7 power supplies, and you could pull out a board, and it self-diagnosed and self-reconfigured. And Al Hopkins was designing this very tightly constrained Apollo guidance computer. If you look at the shuttle software, I once tried to calculate how many lines of debugged code they got per person per day. And the answer was 3.
IBM figured 1.
1, okay. It may well have been. My very rough calculation.
My
was
wife
that-
was a software engineer at IBM, and 1 was their metric.
No, I
1 line of software per day per programmer, developed, debugged, and in production.
Yes.
I used to teach them.
Really? Yeah. No.
Stochastic aspects.
But again, you mentioned the word software. You've forgotten the hardware, the people, the attackers, the whole mess. And I have 2 cases in my history, my personal history. The first one was the air traffic control remediation, where IBM was writing a proposal. SRI was helping with the graphics for the controllers, what needed to be on the screen. And lo and behold, I walk in there. You may have heard this story. I say, show me the architecture for your en route traffic control remediation with overlapping sectors and communications among all of the different sectors as the plane flies across. And the guy says, what do you mean architecture? We're going to use a mainframe. Okay? So $4 billion later, and many, many years, they canceled the entire project. A few years later, I'm at the IRS as the Commissioner's Advisory Group member as a privacy advocate. And I walk in there and I say, show me the architecture for your modernization program. And the guy who was in charge of all this says, what do you mean architecture? We're going to use a mainframe. All of our programmers are mainframe programmers. That's all they know. And the system engineers were guys who didn't understand developing systems. Another $4 billion down the tubes. So you talk about software, but in 3 weeks I'm going to talk about Thunderclap, which is this devastating hardware attack. And you got to think big when they say, well, there was never a software problem in the shuttle. But I've in my list, which I got over here on my website, there are 8 or 9 shuttle problems, serious problems.
Okay.
But yes, technically speaking, they weren't software problems.
Well, my question really was, is it simply a matter of cost? Because the software development effort for that was maybe an order of magnitude larger than most commercial products.
Mm-hmm.
That's not quite true, Peter. It's 800 Category 1 problems and 1,600 Category 2 problems.
Okay.
That came from the Challenger report.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's still unresolved, even though it's obsolete.
Yeah, but just the ones that I've documented are all over the map in terms of what happened. Now, when Al Hopkins designed that Apollo guidance computer, the NASA guys said, we can't ever let the astronauts touch the hardware. So we're going to embed it 3 levels deep under all kinds of stuff so they can never get at it. There was a shuttle flight later where they actually had to replace a board. And they figured out, well, maybe we better not put the hardware embedded so deeply that they can't touch it. But it's the old story about the pilot and the dog. So at any rate, yeah, I think most people think software. I think hardware, software, people, networks, squirrels. SRI has had 7 squirrel sites. The first 5, I think, were where the squirrel arced himself over the junction between PG&E and SRI. So we put in a cogeneration plant. And that had been up for a few weeks, and the squirrel arcs himself across the cogeneration plant junction with PG&E. Fries SRI, one of my computers, completely fried in the process. So the problems that we have to deal with are tremendously varied. Hardware, software, people, hackers, and God knows what. Squirrels, power outages. And so this is where we're heading. So we're going to worry in 3 weeks about how do we design something that is really secure, reliable, and trustworthy. But for today, the idea is, what can we do for the youth of America and all of the foreign students who are going to go off and build stuff elsewhere to understand that these risks are there, and they've been there for as long as I can remember. And I'm 87. I go way back in the Wayback, my own Wayback Machine. And the comment I made earlier, is that we keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again, in different guises perhaps, but they're still basically the same. Buffer overflows, yeah.
So why don't we teach this stuff?
Well, that's an interesting question. For those of you out there who are former MIT people, MIT used to teach Salzer and Schroeder and later Kashuk. They used to teach a lot of things about the principles of security and operating systems. Not much on hardware, even though Multics was very innovative in terms of its hardware. My comment on education goes back to the MIT days where the cryptographers do not have to take a systems course. And so I keep getting cryptographers coming to me and saying, look, I've got this absolutely perfect, 100% guaranteed cryptographic algorithm that nobody can break. And it's like one of these movies where the guy pulls out a gun and shoots the martial arts guy. If our systems are so fundamentally broken in hardware and in software and in operational procedures and preventive maintenance and God knows what else, we need a fundamental change in education. And there's an article that I just published in the ACM this month. One of the other things that I mentioned, which I didn't mention, is the Inside Risks series in the ACM, which started in 1990, I think. This is how might we increase system trustworthiness. That's in the current issue of the CACM. It's sort of a very rough cut at what might we do to make things better. But it's by no means an answer. So getting back to your question on education, the reason I'm here, where I mentioned to Dennis Allison that this might be one of the multiple topics I'd be happy to talk about, was simply that over the years I've come to Stanford, and I taught at Stanford in '64. I've come here and gone through this kind of reasoning. So this is not a new concept for me. This is something I've been banging on for forever. So what do we do in education to make students aware that it's more than this programming language that they've learned and now they think they are software engineers? Or what is more is it that they can understand that the hardware is flawed, and if the hardware is going to fail, then you can't trust the operating system and the applications. So, very simple comment. The question is, how do you actually get to the point where our students today begin to understand it? Some of you have been there before, and you've been through all this many times, and you've even built systems that didn't work, and you presumably learned lessons from it.
Yeah, somebody asked me how I learned so much about security. I said, by doing stuff wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
And learning.
I remember Andy Kinslow in Kinslow in '67. In '67, he was asked how he could build an IBM system that was more robust. And he said, if only they'd let me do it one over, I'd get it right the second time. Maybe, yeah.
A little more like.
And Fred Brooks always said, build one and to throw it away so you can learn something from it. But the problem is that we don't learn from our mistakes. Some of us do. You do, I do. But this is not something that is taught. What do we know about teaching how to build large systems? Well, I grew up in the Multics era, where for 5 years I was commuting to MIT every other week from Bell Labs. And I learned a hell of a lot about building software. Corbetto, who just died. In fact, I'm going to his memorial service a couple of weeks, was somebody who was a stickler for detail. And we had a system where nobody writes a line of code until there was a specification talking about all of the inputs to the module and all of the outputs and what was the state space, long before there was this formal methodology for doing that. This was 65. In 65, we solved the buffer overflow problem. In 65, we solved the Y2K problem in Multics. Okay, so why, there's a question for you guys. Why didn't that rub off on anybody else?
Multics didn't solve the excess authority problem.
No, it didn't.
See? So it didn't solve all the problems.
No, it never said it did.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just saying that it solves some and not others. Other systems solve a different, perhaps overlapping set.
Yeah, but if 10 years ago, 70% of all problems were buffer overflows,
Yeah.
then you'd think somebody would say, hey, why don't we go back in history and figure out how that was done in Multics?
Well, there's a cost question here. 3 lines of code per day.
Yeah.
It's 3 times as good as the IBM standard.
Yeah.
If that translates to you get to dethrone the 370 in 1968, what company wouldn't have made that choice even if it was somewhat less reliable? You know,
Depends who's paying for it.
Depends who's paying for it, but we buy things that don't work all the time.
Oh, yeah,
Don't
but
work
if
all
you can get away with making garbage and selling it, then you've got a business model.
We just described the computer industry.
That's true.
That's also a cultural thing. There are some people are a little more careful than others.
Yeah.
So, he asked about teaching this stuff. Can you hire people that know how to write good software?
That's a good question. Can you hire people who know how to build good software? There are people like Dave Parnas. Parnas is a licensed software engineer in Canada. He actually has a license to practice software engineering. In this country, we have people who have written one program language, one program or 2 or 3 programs, and they think they're software engineers. Doesn't work. So the problem is you got to teach all of the, here, let me get you guys on mic. You don't need to sign an agreement here before just talking on mic.
I like what you say, and I grew up in a similar kind of world, and I had to do biological stuff where intracranial robots can't have a software error. Pacemakers can't have a software error.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a whole different world doing reliable software.
Well, Dave Parnas is, again, a poster child for that. He has a pacemaker, and he got out of the hospital, and every time he would fall asleep, the pacemaker would kick in and wake him up. There was no hysteresis. It was a bang-bang control system. So he goes to the doctor, and he says, give me the programmer's manual for this device. And the doctor says, there is no programmer's manual. So is there a user's manual, a doctor's operational manual? The guy spends 5 minutes trying to thumb through his desk, and he finally finds one, buried in the bottom of his desk. He never read it. Okay? So if you think that medical devices are immune to all of this because they're more carefully designed,
Well, I don't.
think about the Therac 25. The Therac 20 had a hardware interlock that prevented you from switching from very high intensity radiation to low intensity therapeutic radiation. When they built the 25, they forgot to put that interlock in software because it wasn't in the hardware. And they killed a whole bunch of people.
I totally agree with you. And like I work for Medtronics, and I did not work for Intermedic.
Mhm.
Intermedic had the problem with the pacemakers. And GE didn't have the problem with the radiation, but the other company, Macalet, did.
Yeah. Is that on?
My wife had a Medtronic pacemaker defibrillator with the bad wires. So that was a hardware failure.
More of a question. How can we reward documenting these problems and overcoming the embarrassment of how did I let that get through?
Let me throw that question back at you. How many papers do you know about the failures that were made in developing a system? The dead ends, the things that they didn't pursue because they knew it was the wrong thing to do, or because they'd spent 2 years researching it and suddenly it backfires when they put it into the system.
Well, we can interview that also. I do that all the time.
I-
Everything.
I'd make the claim that it's an economic problem. Many companies won't pay for good software. They'll pay for
Yeah,
bad software.
That's right.
The answer to that is our buddy, Don. And what Don did, amongst other things, is, he rewarded people.
Say that again. You need to be heard by the
Yeah, the
outliner.
answer to that question is Peter and my friends Knuth, who, whenever errors are found, he paid power of 2 pennies.
Mm-hmm.
And I unintentionally found a couple errors. He's just a longtime friend to me. And, I got 2 Knuth checks out of that. No, it's not a large amount of money, but it's the attitude. And then he did a superb paper titled The Errors of Tech. And I'm particularly pissed off at people who really like tech or LaTeX. He doesn't care for LaTeX personally, but the problem with tech is, it held back volumes of the art of computer programming, which is a far more important work in our field than pretty-looking text, which really ticks me off. And, he understands that I feel this way. I felt this way in 80, whatever it was when I first met him. But no, I mean, you guys aspire to trying to be as good as Don, but you guys are just largely talk in that regard. He actually comes forth.
Yeah, good comment. Now, let's apply that to software and security. There are more zero-day flaws known in the community in the dark web than there are known vulnerabilities. The MITRE NIST repository is now something like 130,000 vulnerabilities, most of which have not been fixed. Yeah.
There's a topic you haven't mentioned, and that's a pretty serious one too for vulnerabilities, and that's policy governance. I went to a talk on the OWASP, which records vulnerabilities, top 10 for APIs. So here's a question for the audience. Where's the best place to find API keys for services that you don't have permission to use? GitHub, exactly right. People just put them in GitHub in open projects.
Yeah.
And that, even with every perfect software and perfect hardware, if you don't write your policies right, you're not going to have any security.
This is true. That's a very good comment. Okay, you guys have been quiet. Any comments here?
We'll get more. Go on.
Okay. So the frustrating part of all of this is what comes around goes around, and it comes back again and bites you another time. And we've talked about medical devices. There were not only pacemaker problems in the Therac 25, there are lots of other documented medical devices that are failing. And even in the last few months of risks, I have more of them.
Especially recently.
Say it again?
Especially recently.
Especially recently. I think this is like bridge building. Henry Petrusky, who's an old friend of mine, writes the article in the American Scientist every issue. He wrote a book on To Err is Human, and he wrote a whole bunch of books about bridge building. And he pointed out that bridge builders got more and more creative until they had a collapse. Then they backed off, and they've got to be much more careful. The Northwest vibration problem.
Comaneros.
Yeah, where they never anticipated that much shilly-shallying and horizontal motion. The London the walking bridge, again, they built the damn thing, people walked on it, and all of a sudden it's unstable. Petrosky kept saying, well, you know, we learn a lot from the bridges that fail, because then we have to back off and figure out what we did wrong. The 9/11 building was an example of the way that was engineered was very badly thought out.
The autoxium was very interesting.
Yeah.
It was predictable.
That's the topic of NOVA tonight at 9 o'clock.
Okay, good.
So,
I'll have to get back from my rehearsal at 7:30 and get back to it. Get my wife to record it. So, where do we stand in this whole mess? Well, the education is not up to snuff. The engineering standards are not up to snuff. The training of programmers is always narrow.
Could we say our software engineering metrics aren't right?
The metrics are not right, absolutely. That gets me into, what do you know about security metrics? Is the system 100% secure? No. Is it 1% secure? No. As soon as the flaw is found, it's 0% secure.
I object to that statement because
Okay.
I personally assume that the attacker is smarter than me,
Yeah.
and the attack will succeed. So I try to design software that will minimize the damage that gets done when the attack succeeds, not if.
Yeah.
And so it is secure. I can bound the damage
Yeah.
and decide if that's tolerable. So I'm not putting a number on it like 1% or 2%.
Yeah. Good. Okay.
Fail-safe.
Here we
I
go.
was gonna ask what 1% secure means.
Doesn't mean anything, obviously.
My brother was into mechanical engineering, bridge safety, working for a government lab. I don't tell you which one, but he had to deal with all this. And there's among the things, there is something called fail-safe. You can design stuff, and you can continuously test, like your bridges
Yeah.
or your cables.
Yeah.
And they even had devices to do that. So
Yes,
yes, but I don't see that with computers.
that's right. Well,
Mechanical engineers are usually thought to have lower IQ. No, they have the higher IQ. Sorry.
Yeah, Steve Lipner. Steve Lipner used to call himself a civil engineer, an uncivil engineer. Yeah.
I keep thinking that if we design, given something will fail, that it's a fail soft, you know, like the Northeast power failure in '65, it didn't have to propagate.
No.
Had the appropriate boundary conditions been set to minimize.
Yeah, and as I said, that's a problem that they thought they had solved in '65 after the Northeast power blackout. And each successive fix was subverted by a different mode of failure. One of the West Coast ones, in fact, the one that took out all the West Coast states and Baja California, was the one where the guy who was the spotter in the woods saw the fire breaking out and he couldn't find the phone number that he was supposed to call. Okay. So again, we get to the problem that it's not just the software, it's not just the hardware, it's not just the squirrels and everything else. It's the whole system. And that's the thing that I think is most missing from education today. I can't think of a single university that teaches systems as systems, where it's not just a system on a chip, it's the entire system of everything that has to work.
There are some around.
Are there? Tell me one.
No.
Oh,
You do the homework. I want an independent check.
That's
I have
not
my
fair.
own list.
That's not fair. I want your
No,
list.
no.
No?
I'll find my brother, my late brother, but you have to ask him.
Yeah.
That's a little tough to use.
That's very hard to do.
No, you're right, but among other things, it's not only that. I talked about fail-safe or fail-soft,
Yeah.
whatever. But there's also over-design. Turns out the people who know the theory, they now have to fight over-design.
Yeah.
Like for nuclear power plants, they used the best steel they could, whatever.
Yeah.
It turns out the best steel gets brittle when the nukes come. But
Yes.
anyway,
Yeah, that's right. So again, it's the holistic problem of...
the point is we don't see that in computers nor some in electrical engineering,
Exactly.
not in computers.
Yeah, I
It's
agree.
too cheap to make money.
Yeah, I agree. And
So they don't worry about
remember, you are the beta testers.
Yeah.
Good, I'm glad that...
The concepts are here in various disciplines.
Yeah,
So we have known about principle of least privilege since '74.
yeah,
When we presented our virus-safe computing environment for Windows XP to Microsoft,
yeah.
we pointed out that it wasn't enforcing least privilege, and they said, of course it does, at the level of the user.
Yeah.
And it occurred to me that we never talk about the granularity at which we're applying least privilege.
Yeah.
And that we should be applying it at the smallest possible granularity, and I just haven't seen that discussed.
Yeah. You will see that in what I'm talking about in 3 weeks, of course.
Yes.
And you're going to see granularity of compartmentalization as well, where you can have gross compartmentalization. You can have very fine grain that is efficiently executable by the hardware.
It's certainly not common in the discussion.
It is not common at all. And again, that is one. Well, that goes back to that goes back to Salzer and Schroeder and the principle of least privilege.
Just very quickly, there's also a cost issue. If you have multi-level systems, you may have to spread it, but ever.
No, you can do it. We've done it.
I know we can.
But even if you have the technical capability, how many people in the room who have Windows computers do not run normally as an administrator?
We built our virus-safe computing environment. You ran as administrator. If you got the virus, it did so little harm you didn't care.
Yeah, but it's you have to go out of your way to not be an administrator on a Windows machine.
No, they were administrator. That's the point.
Yeah, I know, but
How many people in this room are running Windows? 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 and a half.
People run normal OSs.
I haven't done mission critical stuff for about 10 years, but before that, every Intel processor that was sold had a disclaimer on this box that said not to be used for medical
Yeah,
devices.
Windows has the same disclaimer.
Same thing with Microsoft.
Yeah.
You had to go through a hospital, and what do I see? Lots of Intel and Microsoft.
And then there was the Avi Rubin story. He's sitting in the hospital in Morristown Memorial, New Jersey, and he has total access to the hospital system with his laptop. There's no protection whatsoever.
How long ago was that?
That was 10, 15 years ago.
I want to answer respond to Andy's remark. Your remark was exactly my point about the granularity of least privilege. All our commonly used operating systems apply it at the granularity of the user. Every program you run has all your permissions, whether you're administrator or not. What we did was we simply launched each application in a different guest account. And then if CryptoLocker ran, it didn't have access to any of the stuff.
No, my comment was that just because they've given a privilege boundary, it was never used. By 0.1% of the people don't run as administrators.
On XP you had to.
Yeah. Did you have to?
Yeah. Couldn't get anything done.
Okay. Because I've been, somewhere, I'm one of the 4 people in the world
10
who
minutes.
don't run
Okay.
as administrator at home.
On XP, not much ran.
Yeah, that shrink lap thing is very annoying because all of these life-critical systems are using systems that they've been told not to do that. So that's not encouraging. Yeah.
So many years ago, when I was at DEC, there was a memo passed around called "Bugs Are Good."
Yeah.
Have you seen a copy of this?
I think I have, yeah.
But the context was hardware rather than software.
Yeah.
But the key part of it was to learn from the bugs and while you're having lunch,
Yeah.
bullshit about them and see if you can take advantage of
Right.
it or not get caught about it.
Yeah.
Do any software people do that? None that I hang out with.
Not
but
that I know. A little bit, yes. We certainly do it in the architecture that Cambridge and SRI are developing. There's a tremendous amount of synergy there among the entire team. I've got about 20 people in Cambridge working on this, and they are really, really good, talking to each other.
So what Yelp does, this was a talk I went to a couple of years ago. What Yelp does is they assign a security-inclined person, and they have a way of filtering for these. Every development team has at least one security-inclined person who makes sure that they have those discussions over lunch, at the basketball court,
Yeah.
or during product meetings.
This is great if that person has social skills and is able to communicate with everybody. Otherwise, you get into the horrible effect that.
There is militaries, they do that too.
Yeah.
At least they're conscious about it.
Yeah.
Some are obviously don't care.
Well, Conways Law says that's going to kill you. If these two guys don't talk to each other, the system is going to reflect exactly that.
But there was also that person was also a developer. So it wasn't that it was just somebody standing on the side saying do security. This person was also one of the developers. So part of the team, that's what they found made the difference. It wasn't an outsider.
Back to your fundamental question. How do you teach this, or what was the mechanism? How do you get people to teach this
Yeah.
properly?
Well, both Harvard and MIT are currently completely renovating their computer science curricula. MIT, I'll be back there in 2 weeks, and I had a long chat with Howie Schroeb, who's involved in this, and they are really trying to make it hands-on, where everybody has detailed hands-on stuff going on. Harvard is doing the same thing. Yeah.
It seems to me that this is largely an economic issue. If you could get rich quickly producing reliable software,
Yeah.
all the students would be signing up for reliability
That's right.
classes.
That's right. But it's not in the job description of most people, and it's not in the business plan of most companies.
So Mark Stigler got very worried about one laptop per child, that all these people in the third world countries would become vulnerable to Nigerian letter attacks. And so his solution was to, as part of the training to use your laptop, you had to mount a Nigerian letter attack. I wonder if the education couldn't be a course on system hacking to get people to think that way.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. We're running out of time here, so final comments, last thoughts. You want to tell me who's doing it right? No? Okay. Well, you're hiding.
There are people around.
Well, some of us are trying to do it right, but I mean, the question is, how do you get this out to the community at large? Okay, that's it for me for today. Thank you very much for being here.